Here is a question most people never think to ask. What happened to the ancient humans who were born different? Not different in personality, different in body. A child born with a cleft lip, a dwarf, an albino, conjoined twins, a baby missing a limb. Before hospitals, before surgery, before any understanding of genetics or birth defects, how did your ancestors treat the ones who came out not quite right? The answer is not simple. The answer is actually two answers, and they contradict each other. Some ancient humans were treated with extraordinary care. Others were left to die. And figuring out which one happened when tells us something uncomfortable about human nature. Let us start with the evidence of care. In 1960, archaeologists digging in Shanidar cave in Iraq found something that changed the way we think about Neanderthals. Skeleton Shanidar 1 was a male who lived to be between 35 and 50 years old. That is old for a Neanderthal. He had a deformed right arm that never fully developed, likely from birth. The arm was withered, the bones thin and weak. He was also blind in his left eye and deaf in one ear. Despite all of this, he lived for decades. He was not abandoned, he was not killed. He was fed, protected, and carried by his group for his entire life. Someone had to bring him food because he could not hunt. Someone had to protect him because he could not fight. Someone had to carry him when the group moved, and they did. Shanidar 1 was not the only one. In Vietnam, the skeleton of a man with severe dwarfism was found buried alone with no grave goods. He lived about 4,000 years ago. His bones showed he was fed and cared for as a child, but as an adult he became isolated. The community fed him but did not include him. He survived, he did not thrive. In Egypt, a dwarf named Seneb lived 4,500 years ago and rose to become a high-ranking official. He was a wealthy nobleman, married with children, buried in a mastaba tomb near the pyramids. His statue shows him with his wife and children, depicted with respect, not pity. Ancient Egyptians considered dwarfs to be blessed by the gods, associated with the god Bes, who protected households. They were jewelers, dancers, and administrators. They were not outcasts, they were neighbors. In Japan, a 3,000-year-old skeleton of a young woman with a severe spinal deformity was found buried in a formal cemetery with the same rituals as everyone else. She was not separated, she was not hidden. She was buried as part of the community. The evidence of abandonment is just as real. In ancient Greece, the philosopher Plutarch described the practice of exposing deformed infants. A child born with a visible deformity would be left on a hillside overnight, exposed to the elements. If someone found them and took them, they survived. If no one came, they did not. The same practice existed in ancient Rome. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code written in 449 BCE, explicitly stated that deformed children should be killed. It was not a secret, it was law. In Sparta, newborns were examined by elders. If a baby was judged too weak or deformed, it was left at the foot of Mount Taygetus to die. This was not cruelty as we understand it. It was considered a practical necessity for a society that depended on every person being a functional soldier or mother. A 2021 study of Roman infant burial sites found something disturbing but expected. In an infant cemetery in Ashkelon, Israel, over 100 baby skeletons were found buried under a Roman bathhouse. Many showed signs of deformities or disease. They had been discarded, not buried. The bathhouse was built on top of them to mask the smell. This was not an exception. This was standard practice across the Roman Empire for centuries. Archaeological evidence matches these accounts. At a site in Israel, the skeleton of a child with severe hydrocephalus was found discarded in a cave away from the main burial ground. In Britain, a Roman-era cemetery contained the remains of infants buried separately from adults, some with signs of disease or deformity. In the Americas, a 9,000-year-old skeleton of a young woman with a deformed spine was found buried alone, far from any settlement. What determined care versus abandonment? The evidence suggests the answer was functional contribution. Could the person contribute enough to justify the cost of keeping them alive? A Neanderthal with one good arm could still process food, tend fires, and watch children. A dwarf in Egypt could work as a jeweler. A blind man could still listen and warn of danger. But a child with severe disabilities who could never walk, talk, or feed themselves, that child was a burden no small group could afford. In a group of 30 people where every adult had to work constantly just to survive, carrying a non-functional member could mean starvation for everyone. This was not cruelty, it was math. The margin between survival and death was so thin that one extra mouth that did not produce could tip the balance. Your ancestors were not heartless, they were desperate, and desperation makes hard decisions that modern people with refrigerators and hospitals will never have to make. But here's the part that stays with you. In many cultures, people born different were not just tolerated, they were valued. The Navajo believed that people with albinism or unusual features had special spiritual power. In some Native American tribes, two-spirit people, those whose gender identity differed from their birth sex, were honored as having both masculine and feminine spirits. They were often the shamans, the healers, the marriage counselors. Their difference was not a weakness, it was a gift. In Siberia, people with epilepsy were treated as shamans, their seizures interpreted as journeys to the spirit world. In parts of West Africa, children born with albinism were believed to be magical. In some cases, they were protected. In others, they were killed for their body parts, their bones ground into potions believed to bring luck and wealth. The same condition, worshipped and hunted. On the Pacific island of Tonga, people born with intellectual disabilities were called Onga, meaning gentle-hearted. They were cared for by the entire village. No one was turned away. In the Andes, the Moche people of Peru depicted dwarfs and people with physical deformities in their art as priests and ritual specialists. They were painted into murals performing secret ceremonies. They were not hidden, they were celebrated. In the highlands of New Guinea, some tribes believed that children born with deformities were spirit children who chose the wrong mother. They were not killed, they were returned to the spirit world through ritual, which meant they were left in the forest. The same belief system that motivated care in one culture motivated abandonment in another. A 2017 study published in the International Journal of Paleopathology examined 66 prehistoric skeletons with signs of disability or deformity. They found 3 distinct patterns: people who received long-term care and survived into old age, people who were cared for as children but abandoned as adults, and people who were killed or discarded at birth. The same condition could produce different outcomes depending on when and where you were born. A dwarf in ancient Egypt could become a wealthy nobleman. A dwarf in ancient Greece could be sold as a curiosity. A dwarf in Sparta would not have survived the night. Your ancestors looked at a baby born different and made a decision every single time: keep them or leave them. There was no policy, no law, no universal rule. It came down to the group, the resources, and the beliefs of the people standing around that newborn. Sometimes they kept them, fed them, carried them for decades. Sometimes they turned away. The man in Shanidar cave lived to be an old man with one withered arm, one blind eye, and one deaf ear. He was not a burden to his people. He was one of them. He ate their food, shared their fire, and died surrounded by his group in a cave that preserved his bones for 50,000 years. Someone carried him. Someone fed him. Someone chose him. The next time you see someone who looks different or moves different, remember, that choice is as old as humanity itself, and your ancestors made it long before anyone had a word for compassion.